Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for sticking around to the last session of the day. I really appreciate it. I'm going to try and spend a few minutes just giving you some insights in how to get published and what we look for at high-impact journals. Now, as our moderator says, this is a didactic session, so if you've got questions, don't feel that you can't stick your hand up, grab a microphone. I will take questions as we go. Some of your questions might be preempted by some of the stuff I say, but feel free to jump in. So I'm going to be covering these 5 areas. A little bit of an introduction about the Lancet, how you write a paper and submit that paper, what editors look for, so that's the really key bit about looking under the hood at what we do and what I do every day of the week. Peer review, how that process works, because successful publication relies on working the peer review system too. And how you revise your submission is equally important as how you originally submit it. And then also I'm going to show you a little bit of the kind of the future universe in publishing, which there's a lot of threats out there to publishing, which I think you all need to be aware of. So let's start. Why do you want to publish? I think that's a really fundamental question. Well, the positives is that you work in an industry where you have a privileged position to actually speak to your peers. How many industries where you can speak to your peers and give them advice on how to do their job? It's quite remarkable, actually, when you think about it in those terms. Well, so the positives are you get to influence thinking and current practice. You can improve patient outcomes. That's why we're all here, right? Personal recognition, of course, to prove your work is of a high caliber. As a professional obligation to society, we're in this universe where we do have this obligation to report our work, our findings. Healthcare is driven by research, and research is only useful if people can read it and work from it. The personal challenge of writing papers. A lot of people get a big kick out of the challenge of just writing a paper. And of course, improving your career prospects. But what are the negatives? It takes a lot of time. It takes you away from your core activities. It opens you up to criticism and judgment from others. Who wants that, really? It can lead to rejection, a lot of rejection. My journal publishes 4% of everything submitted. I'm reading 10 to 20 papers every day of the week submitted to the journal. So, as our moderator said, if you get published in a high-impact journal, you're in a very rarefied special club, and to be published once in these sorts of journals is a career achievement. And it's stressful. So the Lancet, as you would have seen earlier today, we have a large portfolio of journals. So let me start talking about the keys to success. I think you can summarize them really in these 4 points. It's answering the right question in the right way at the right time. It's making your submission as compelling as possible to the editor. It's writing in an accessible way. It's writing that someone can understand what you're trying to say. And for research articles, and that's what I'm really going to focus on most this evening, it's about following rules. And the basic rule is the IMRAD rule: introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Most research papers are all about rules, following those guidelines to the letter. Now, I know it's always a bind, but reading the information for authors really does help. I know they're huge documents to read, but they really contain everything you need to know about getting your paper submitted accurately and getting it received in a positive way. But I mentioned that there is a basic rule of writing a research paper, the IMRAD rule of thumb. But for certain types of research, there are additional rules about how that research should be reported, following that basic structure. And these are known as reporting standards. And if you look at this website, the Equator Network, it sets out all the different reporting standards for different types of research papers. And journals love following rules like this because it allows consistency from paper to paper, from journal to journal. It allows people to understand papers and studies and research in a consistent way and learn in a consistent way. So, for example, a randomized controlled trial should follow what's called the CONSORT guidelines. But there are lots of different guidelines here with some really phenomenal acronyms, MOOSE and PRISM and STROBE and all these types of things, but they cover different types of studies, observational studies, molecular studies, animal research, etc., etc. There's a guideline for reporting research in all of these different types of fields. But there's new guidelines coming along every day. And the most recent one is the SAGA guidelines. And these are looking at sex and gender reporting. Increasingly important to disaggregate your data by sex and gender, because we know that men and women respond differently to different treatments. But in the past, we've never disaggregated that. In the same way that we need to have much better race and equity dissemination of data. Because I'm standing here in front of an audience where you're probably looking at me thinking, all of the research we know has been done in people like me, a white Caucasian from a high-income country. What's the relevance? This is a big failing in science. We need you all to do more research. We need to understand really how these treatments work. And so these are guidelines that are coming down the pipe now and will really influence what journals publish. So let's get into kind of the nitty-gritty of putting a paper together. The manuscript title. This really matters. You know, use a descriptive sentence, avoid long titles, and use a non-declamatory phrase. What I mean by this is, how many times have you seen a paper published and it says, drug X improves outcome for patient Y? Well, you've given the reader the answer. Don't you want them to read the paper? So don't give away the storefront before you've actually enticed the reader into the paper. So don't give the answer away in the title. And I give an example here of the sort of classic title, which gives away nothing but says a lot. And this is a classic trial type of title. Pazopanib plus cetuximab in recurrent or metastatic head and neck squamous cell carcinoma, an open-label phase 1b expansion study. So it's told you what the intervention is, what the setting is, and what type of research study has taken place. But you haven't given the answer. But that type of description for a title is really discoverable online, and that's another key point. You want people to find your papers through PubMed, Medline, Web of Science, Scopus, ScienceDirect, SciVal, whichever bibliometric source you use. So sometimes being clever in titles isn't that clever because they're not discoverable. So just stick to the facts in titles. Abstracts for research articles should be structured, again, around this IMRAD rule. Background, methods, findings, interpretation, funder. The background, the abstract should be really short as well. 200-300 words. Background is simply a sentence telling you what the aim of the study is. I think, unfortunately, we saw this morning in a lot of the junior presentations we had this morning, the aim, the objective, were the same statement repeated. They're different things. They're different things. The methods in an abstract should be just a very brief summary of the patient characteristics, the details of the regimens or intervention done, how randomization was done, for example, how the analyses are done. Just really quick bullet point, not even, very short sentences. Findings, just the efficacy for the primary output, the primary endpoint. No other endpoints matter in an abstract. It's the primary endpoint, it's the only one. But you will see sometimes, and this is a tip to when you're reading, if in the abstract the findings are heavily skewed towards a secondary or tertiary endpoint in a study, that probably means the study hasn't worked. Because a lot of papers are what we call as editors spun, which means there's a lot of hyperbole put into the language, and there's a lot of emphasis on the bits of the study that worked to the exclusion of the bits that didn't work. And if a study is not reporting the primary outcome, that probably means it did not work. For the interpretation, don't just restate the findings, say what they mean clinically and in context. What are the implications? And you should always include a line on the funder, the source of funding, because that also influences interpretation for the reader. In the introduction of a paper, again, keep it really short. 200 words, perhaps 150 words, if you can get away with that. Be concise. Briefly review the current understanding in the field, and use that background to then frame your study and what you are aiming to do. What's your objective in this study? Why is it needed? Don't include any results, conclusions, discussion. None of that should be in the introduction. I see it in introductions all the time. It shouldn't be there. Methods. Ensure there's enough detail in the methods for someone else reading your paper to repeat your work. That's the basic of it. But double, triple check that when you put in drug doses, radiation schedules, routes of administration, that they're correct. Because the last thing we want in the literature is mistakes with critical information like that. For trials, always report the randomization and the masking. Always describe your patient population, how they were accrued, or for retrospective studies, how the samples were derived, what the timeframes were, and have a clear and detailed statistical method section in that part of the paper. The results. Now, as I mentioned for the abstract, clearly report the primary outcome, the primary endpoint of the study, and say whether it's been met or not. If the study was underpowered, you're under-recruited, then it probably hasn't been met. Just be very honest and transparent about your results. You don't need to spin them. Let the reader make up their own mind. And for all data, always give an indication of precision. 95% confidence interval, hazard ratios, odd ratios, risk ratios, just so we can get an understanding of the scale of precision. And as a sidebar to this, a p-value of 0.05, everyone uses that as statistical significance, but that is actually a guess. Statistical significance can be whatever you set it at, but the smaller that p-value, the better the chance that the result is not a freak finding. Follow the reporting of your results as you set it out in your protocol. If it's a trial, and you've gone off piste, you've deviated from the protocol, that's a red flag to an editor. Give actual numbers of patients rather than the percentages. We saw a little bit of this today, I think, in some of the sessions where comments are around 100% of patients achieved X or Y, and it was one patient. Or we say, you may see, I see this quite a lot where someone's put, the drug improved survival by 50%. It was 2 patients down to 1. Is that an improvement? I don't think so. So give actual numbers. And consider the inclusion of video or animated visuals. In the old days, and when I was coming through, you couldn't do that sort of stuff. But most people in this audience are far younger than me, and this is what drives the universe. But also, if you're a surgeon, for example, it's much easier to understand what's happened with a video of the surgery, with a small description, rather than some long piece of prose with, as we know, surgeons love very long names for procedures with 28 letters in them. It's much easier to watch the video. In your discussion, one of the main problems we see is overinterpretation of the data. As I said, spinning the data to come up with a positive result when there perhaps isn't a positive interpretation. Be critical with what your paper shows without any of that elaboration. Focus on the main findings and what needs to be done. Report your key findings in the first paragraph and then elaborate and add the context to your findings, how they sit within the literature that's been published to date. What gaps still exist, what limitations are in your study, and how it could be improved on if it was repeated in the future. And sometimes it's quite relevant and quite appropriate to include a table in a discussion if there's a handful of studies, they've all been done on a similar topic, similar themes. You might want to just summarize those in a table rather than writing about them. You can save a lot of time for the reader and avoid repetition. Don't repeat yourself over and over. At Lancet journals, we have some very specific requirements. Again, this is to my point about always look at the information for authors. Every journal has little quirks and different distinctions that they expect to see in papers. For us, we have this panel called the Research in Context, and all research papers we expect to see this. And it's a short panel separated into 3 sections. And it's really to give you that snapshot as a reader of what's going on. The first section is evidence before this study. The second section is the added value of this study. And the third section is the implications of all the work now, including this study. I think that's a really nice, easy framing to take away as a reader. It also helps an editor, especially in some fairly specialized areas. If you're submitted to a general journal, the editor-in-chief will not be an expert in every single thing. So something like this really helps because you're framing your work. Turning the tables a little bit to review articles, we have a section for review articles which is very unique to the Lancet journals called Search Strategy and Selection Criteria. Because again, with review articles, that narrative is influenced by what material you put into the paper, what you found for your literature searches. And we all know literature searches can be biased. You may not use enough search terms, or you might intentionally restrict the research terms to a certain group of words. You might restrict the search to a certain language, or 2 or 3 languages, or over a certain time frame. That's important to report that, and that's what this panel does. It enables you to report exactly how you found the literature upon which your review was based, because then it helps the reader understand the constraints around the written article. Figures and tables. Now, for all journals, they need to be provided in a form that's editable, so just copying and pasting from one place to another is not going to probably work with most journals. So you need to supply them in EPS and docs and the Excel files and formats that we've got the software behind, and we can work with those tables to reformat them for publishing. For Kaplan-Meier curves, the classic survival curves, we always ask that you add the numbers at risk, those patients still alive at every time point, because that allows you to look at things like informative censoring and whether there's any unusual activity in the curves. When you see a Kaplan-Meier curve, for example, where in the first, let's say the first few weeks of the Kaplan-Meier, the first month, there's a really precipitous sharp drop and then it levels out, that's a clear indication that the study, the intervention, is killing a lot of people very fast. And then when you see a nice separation of the curve later on, that's because you've got these long responders. They're not representative of the regular population. So again, that's a question that as an editor, I look at that and I say, okay, this study is not representative of the general population. This is a super responder study. That's not really general. That shouldn't be put into general practice. It's interesting from a scientific point of view, but it's not clinically relevant. And for us, we're looking to publish clinically relevant information. Always use log scales for forest plots. Keep figure legends really short. Again, as an editor, I hate when the figure legend is like 500 words, font size 0.6. You know, I'm putting glasses on over glasses to read it. No one wants to read that. Keep it really short. Avoid poor quality figures, as I mentioned, just copying, pasting them will not work for journals. Check for any inaccuracies before you submit. And in review articles, always keep the number of figures and tables to a manageable number. There's no fixed number per se, but it should be, what I always say to authors, the figures and tables that you use should be the minimum number to best describe the data or best help the narrative in a review. And you shouldn't repeat in your written words, in the prose, in the paper, what you've got in the tables and figures. You want to avoid duplication. References, again, different journals follow different types of referencing styles. We follow the Vancouver style, which is the most commonly used style, but there are many types of referencing styles. The Vancouver style is so cool because it's named after, so that there is an editorial group from across multiple big titles that meets every year. It's called the International Journal of Medical Editors, the ICJME, International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. And their first meeting was in Vancouver, way back when. And so it's become colloquially known as the Vancouver reference style. That's what we use. For references of items in press, we like to see a letter or an email confirming that that paper is in press at another journal. For papers that are submitted to other journals, they should not be referenced. If you're going to indicate you're using data from submitted articles elsewhere, it's effectively unpublished data. So you should indicate in the study, after you've mentioned that bit of data, in parentheses, in brackets, you say unpublished data, and then you attribute it to someone, or personal communication attributed to someone. And we like to see a letter or an email from that person saying they give you permission to cite their unpublished work. And finally, don't use too many references and avoid self-citation. That's a bit of a red flag for me. I don't like authors who just cite themselves. It makes you think this work it's only been done by one person. So how generalizable is it? Trial registration. This is super, super important. If you're going to get a clinical trial published in any journal these days, you should have registered your trial at one of the WHO-approved public registries, and you should register before the first patient. And you should register before the first patient is enrolled. Most journals, mine included, if we receive a trial and it was registered after the first patient or not registered, it's an immediate reject. And there's no coming back from that. There's no appeal.
Now, Prof, can you give a little pause here now? Because I want people to get more interactive now.
Let me just show the register.
Clinical trial. I'll go to clinical trial in a second, but I think Prof has already given you some advice how to write a paper. First, abstract. Do you have any questions about that particular thing? Why abstract is important? And you know that Lancet is a very high-rated paper, a high-rated journal. Of course, they are doing evidence level 1, level 2, double-blinded, randomized control trial. In this country, we don't have that many trials going on. At the same time, double-blinded trial is probably non-existent. But it doesn't mean that we can't do it. So Prof will give you some hints how to actually set up all these kind of trials. But in the meantime, I just want to ask, anybody has got any question at all? Please raise your hand and I'll come to you. Any question to Prof? We want interactive program, that's what I'm just saying. Anything, there's nothing called stupid questions. There's nothing called stupid question. Come on, you can start.
So I want to start. My question is, I have published an abstract in a journal. So I have published my result there. So I want to publish the full paper. So what is the status? It is a published or it's unpublished? Because you say you want a fresh thing, you don't want a used thing. So I have published an abstract,
Yeah.
but I have written a paper, full paper now.
Yeah,
So-
it's a great question, Kamal. It's different to when I was talking about how the abstracts are structured. That's within a full paper. But the question you asked is, for example, conference abstracts and whether they prevent you from submitting a full paper. The answer is they don't. That a conference abstract is not considered a formal publication. So even though you may have in your conference abstract, you see the ASCO abstracts, for example, they include a lot of data, but that doesn't preclude submission of the full paper to any journal later.
Yes,
my next
absolutely. So the question is, abstract is the summary of what you have done, rather than, but unfortunately in this country we do abstract, write abstract, but not writing up the whole paper. It should be the summary of what you have done and summarized in abstract form, and then you can actually produce of course, your work has been done. So, yeah, come on, your next
So
question.
My question was, for the audience, that many of us have published an abstract. So we are scared of submitting to a good journal because somewhere I have published it. So maybe Lancet will not like it because any form I have published it. The answer is, even I have published as an abstract, even high impact journal will take it as a
Absolutely.
paper, number one. Number two, I have published an abstract where my patient number was, say, 100. But when I'm writing a paper, by that time this number has gone to 120 or something. So I am going to update the data because by this time my data.
Yeah.
So when my next question, when I'm submitting to the later to the author, editor, shall I mention that it was published somewhere else? Does it give me a value or doesn't?
No, you needn't mention if you publish an abstract at in a conference proceedings. You needn't mention that at all in your paper. And in the full-length paper, you can update all the results. In fact, we'd encourage that you update the results to the latest data or the latest data point that's defined in the protocol, if it's a protocol-defined study. So, yeah.
Any more questions? Yeah, please, come to me. I'll come to you. Okay, next question.
So, David, you just mentioned that when you do figure or table in the context or in the text, you just mentioned about that figure or table. You don't have to explain it because it's counted as repetition, right? Okay, sorry, maybe closer to. So when I'm writing the full manuscript and I did a table where there's 5, 10 studies, or there is a figure which is self-explanatory, in the text I should not write the detail of it, because that considered as the rewriting or means doubling up or repeating.
Yeah, it's a good question. So what you're talking about there is a situation where perhaps in a discussion, you want to summarize what's been published in the literature. Perhaps there's been 5 or 6 other studies that have been published. So in the discussion, you might pull out, say, an endpoint or a couple of endpoints that are in those papers and are comparable to the same endpoints in your paper. So you literally just present the table, and in the text, you can say, there's been 6 other studies, see table X, primary endpoint is comparable across the studies, or my study is different to all the rest.
All right. Yeah.
Why? You know?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Prof. Yes, please. We'll give other. I think it's echoing here a bit more, so please stop the echo button from there. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So my question is related to the abstract. So I'm not talking about the clinical studies, but the epidemiological studies. So my confusion, where we become confused that whether in the conclusion section we will write the results, without the data, figure, or the recommendation, because some authors are putting their recommendations in the conclusion, in the abstract, So what is the best suggestion? And this is one. And another one is you asked for the numbers not the proportions. But for epidemiological study, when the number is bigger, so I prefer the proportion so that I can imagine. Otherwise, every time I have to recall that what is the denominator there. Thank you.
Yeah, to your second point, if it's a large study and the numbers are big, you take a screening study and it might have hundreds of thousands or millions even, then our recommendation is you include both, the number and the proportion, percentage or HR, or whatever, how you do the proportion. But if it's a really small study, N of 20, N of 30, there's no point doing percentages, it's sort of obvious. To your first point, it's about contextualizing the data and the interpretation of the data.
I mean, in the abstract, whether we will write the, recommendation only in the conclusion section of the abstract or the finding, summarize the results.
So the interpretation in the abstract should be kept really short and just stick to the point. So, this intervention has shown superiority over previous. And that's about all you need to say. You needn't go into the interpretation of what that means. If it's an absolute first, then of course, you might want to say this sets a new standard for treatment. But that's it. In the discussion, you would elaborate on that a lot more. Yeah.
Not the recommendation one in the conclusion. Thank you.
So Dr. David, so my question is quite different. So Lancet has set some high standard, and the cancer is ever changing. So it's may not possible from here in Bangladesh to do some innovative trials with all those immunos, all those TKS, all those genomic studies. So this may not be possible to get attracted by the Lancet editors. So what are the areas you may think from Bangladesh point of view? So that may be the site that as a researcher I can think, so that might be attracted by you.
Of course, the more regional you get with any study, the smaller the number becomes. And that actually then starts limiting where you publish, obviously. But a study of N of 20 or 30 or 40, it depends on the context. So there's nothing wrong with those studies. You take a classic phase 1 or phase 2 study, they're often less than 40 patients in those. Small audits, observational studies of those sorts of numbers, studies from single centers. These types of studies are all very appropriate to be done, and we need that sort of data. But that's where you're going to start limiting yourself to specialist journals, subdiscipline journals, or regional titles. But there's nothing wrong with that. As long as it's a reputable peer-reviewed journal, there's nothing wrong with that at all.
So, sir, can I ask?
Yeah, his question was that, now in oncology, the focus is immunotherapy, focus is translational research and all these things. But we are a resource-limited country. We cannot afford. I have thousands of patients, but I cannot. I want to see the effect of pembrolizumab in this group, but I don't have the money to invest for that. My pharma company is not giving. So somebody sitting in a Western world, they have the luxury. Even our Chinese friends, their pharma is supporting, we heard. But here we are not getting that type of situation. Even I had the great idea, but for this resource, I cannot really do that type of because when I read some medical oncology, all this immuno and high-tech, for us, what should be the area that we should focus? That was
Again, it depends on the journal and what they're interested in. From my journal, I rarely consider any translational research. I want to see clinical data. And there are a lot of journals out there that are only interested in clinical data. When I'm looking at a paper, a new submission, in my mind is, will this change clinical practice? Which is a high bar, obviously, because we're the Lancet, right? Yeah. But there are many journals out there have a similar thing. Is this clinically relevant data? We don't need to know the subgrouping, in molecular analyses and SNPs and all this stuff in every single paper. And there are plenty of translational journals out there as well that do that.
But I'm sure you'll be interested to know that what's happening with all these trials going on abroad and all over the world. But some of the patients cannot afford to use that kind of medication in this country. But we have got some result, interesting results. Non-compliance of these patients, and especially I know Dr. Kamaluddin and also Shumon, they're trying to find out what happened to this group of people. If they can't have 24 doses of, for example, Herceptin, so they stop at about 6 doses.
Yeah, yeah.
But
But that's really important to know.
that's what I'm saying. You can publish that kind
Absolutely.
of data, and Lancet would be more than happy to review that
Absolutely.
article for you. That's right.
Adherence, what are the stops?
Absolutely.
Why was there non-adherence? These are really important clinical questions.
Absolutely. We don't have to always do the research on immunotherapies. Our country, maybe our anatomy, biology is completely different than the Western population. So as long as this is authentic, reliable, I'm sure that will be accepted by most of the journals. Any more
sir,
questions?
can I ask one question? Sir. So,
I think I should just whiz through a few more slides and then we can come back to you, if that's
Is that okay? Okay, carry on.
Okay, so this slide just mentions a number of the registries that are compliant with international standards. The one that probably everyone knows of is clinicaltrials.gov. But there are a huge number here. That's just one. And I've listed, 20-odd trial registries there. And there are many trial registries that are compliant. They have to be publicly accessible, and they have to include the 21 items that WHO mandate as needed for an audience to understand how the trial is being done. And if they meet those criteria, then that's an eligible database. Conflicts of interest, when you're writing your paper, always mention the conflicts of interest. Now, conflict of interest exists when an author or an author's institution has financial or personal relationships with other people or organizations that inappropriately influence or bias his or her actions. And a conflict of interest, it undermines the credibility of the work, it undermines the credibility of the journal, and it undermines the credibility of science. Now, financial interests include employment with a commercial company, stock ownership, honoraria, paid expert testimony. All of these things suggest that you have a vested interest in the answer to the study. It's not a neutral, you're not coming from a neutral place. But conflicts can occur for all sorts of reasons, not just the really obvious ones like that. There are personal relationships. And when we're finding reviewers, that's a big area. Does this reviewer know these authors? Academic competition between departments doing the same work. And sometimes, let's call it intellectual passion, where two people are in the same area and they just kind of spark and fight amongst themselves in journals. Role of the funding source, very similar conflict of interest. You should define where all your funding has come. If you had no funding, you say none. That's absolutely fine. In fact, that's the cleanest type of study you could ever get, none. But you should always define who the study sponsors were and what their role was. Were they involved in the study design? Were they involved in the collection of the data? Were they involved in the analysis, in the interpretation? You know, if this is a big pharmaceutical study funded by a pharmaceutical company, it gets quite murky when you think, so the pharmaceutical company collected the data, they analyzed the data and interpreted it? Really? Is that truly neutral, unbiased opinion? Debatable. It might be, perhaps, but someone who's been in the journal game for a long time, I'm an old cynic and I don't believe, I'm very cynical about everything. And the corresponding author should confirm whether he or she has had access to the data in the study and they had final responsibility to submit the paper. And that's something we're really tough on, is ensuring that authors have seen the data. Role of a medical writer or an independent editor. Now, a lot of pharmaceutical trials, when you're reading these phase 2, phase 3 trial reports in journals like mine, they have often been written not by the the academic authors, entirely by the academic authors that are listed as authors, look to the bottom of the paper where it says acknowledgements or conflicts, and it may disclose a medical communications company. Now that's fine if they're properly moderated, and that's, as editors, that's our job, is to make sure those medical communications companies are reporting the studies in a transparent, honest way and interpreting the data in an honest way. The Lancet, I know we're in a rarefied space in that we have 240 in-house editors. This is our day job. But on most journals, the editors are, like all of you, practicing physicians. You're doing this at 2 o'clock in the morning, reading them papers. You haven't got a lot of time. You're tired. You've come out of the OR after a 15-hour surgery. It's a different situation. So you have to be really careful as a reader to understand who's actually written the paper. You know, ghostwriters should never exist. They should always be declared writers from another organisation, a third party. But just bear that in mind. If a third party has written this paper and it's not written by all of the official academics who cared for the patients, enrolled onto the study, etc., there may be some other issues at play that you have to just consider. The trustworthiness of the study. Data sharing, another very big area these days. Most journals require a statement on whether or how the data will be shared. If you can't share the data and you say, I'm not sharing the data, that's absolutely fine as well. You're not compelled to share data, but it's important that you tell your reader whether you will and won't, and if you will, how. It's seen now as an ethical obligation for data sharing as trial participants, study participants have placed themselves at risk to be on the study. Sharing data might provide observations that might not have been seen. So if other researchers can grab that data out of these databases and do a different analysis. Sharing data increases the confidence and trust in the research conclusions. It hastens research speed and effectiveness because you have multiple people working on the same data sometimes. And it reduces risk for future patients in terms of increased knowledge about trial design, reduction in numbers at risk, and so on. So what do I look on a day-to-day basis? That's how you write a paper. But when I open we have an online submission system, and I go into that in the morning and I see 25 submissions are sitting there waiting for me to read them. What am I looking for? It's a fast process as an editor-in-chief. It's a bit like the X Factor. You've got about 3 minutes to impress. So what am I looking for? Now I'm coming from this rarefied space of being at a high impact journal where we publish just the top 2% going on in the world. I'm rejecting 96% of what we get submitted. So I know I'm in a very different space to most journals. But if you speak to most editors-in-chief of any journal of any level, they all have the same priority. They want to publish the best stuff they get. That's the most impactful. Little I, not the Clariva impact factor, but the most impactful. And these are sort of the questions they'll probably think to themselves, with different thresholds to perhaps what I apply. But we're looking for novel work. I'm looking for what I call first and last. Is this the first ever study in a new field? Is it the last paper, the one that's going to be the reference work that everyone cites for the rest of the time? Does it challenge convention or dogma? I love those papers. Challenge what people have been doing. Why are you doing this? Is it the largest data set to date? So sometimes it might not be the most thrilling read, but if it's the biggest ever study, it's going to be the definitive work that everyone cites. Is the methodology robust? Now, contrary to what people think, we do publish negative trials. I know there's kind of the rhetoric out there that leading journals only publish positive results. That's not the case. A negative result can be super important, especially if it's a drug or an intervention that's become super hyped as the next best thing, but actually it doesn't really work. That's really important to know. That's about challenging dogma. And there's certainly a few interventions I could mention that always get my heckles up. Robotic surgery gets me concerned, for example. But there are many other areas too. We always publish clinical trials. It's the bread and butter of big high-impact journals. Large meta-analyses are the bread and butter as well for us. The topic that we consider has to be relevant to a large demographic, and this comes back to some of the questions just now. If it's data that's relevant to a region, a country, an institution, or a city, then that's probably not relevant to a global audience. And you've got to remember, journals like mine, we have a global readership. So whilst it might be super important in Dhaka or in Bangladesh or in SAARC countries, it might not be relevant to a global audience. That doesn't mean the work isn't important. It's just about the readership. And that's where then other journals come into play. So what are those common barriers to publication? And it's the corollary of what I've been saying, really. Lack of novelty, poorly defined objectives, inappropriate analysis, bias and illogical reporting, poorly conceived arguments and discussion, the Me Too syndrome. This is the 58th study on the same topic in the same disease setting. We don't need that. The literature doesn't need that. The subject is too specialized. Again, I represent a general oncology journal. So something on, resection of the maxilla or something really super specialized is probably not right for a specialist, for a general journal. And one of the clues to where your paper might sit, have a look at the references in your own paper. I mean, it's all super specialized journals that you're referring to in your references. That's a bit of a guide to where you probably should be submitting your paper. Topics that are out of scope. Again, it's amazing what we get submitted, and you think, has this person ever seen the journal? I think the best example I ever had of this was I received a paper that was on the idioms of Mark Twain. Now, Mark Twain is a famous historic American author. I have no idea why a cancer journal would be interested in the teachings of an American historic author. So, consider the journal that you're submitting to. Is it really the right place? And sometimes the presentation is so poor, it's just really hard to navigate a paper. Salami slicing. This is one of my bugbears. I think this is a very European phrase. Salami is a sausage in Europe, and it's cut very, very thinly. Now think about, you've got a data set, and instead of publishing one or two really great papers, you decide, I'm going to publish 20 tiny papers. It happens all the time. Journals really don't like that. Just publish one or two really great papers. Don't slice the data as thin as you can get it to get the maximum number of publications out of it. Publishing isn't, I think as I said in my talk at lunchtime, publishing isn't the point. That's the start of the journey. Mathematical errors. These are big problems. Again, we're looking for when we're looking at new submissions. Are there insufficient numbers to address the objectives with confidence, statistically speaking, with confidence? Are the analyses appropriate? Are they inappropriate? Is there inconsistent reporting of the data? And we see this quite a lot. You'll see a data point in the abstract. It's different in the results, it's different in the table, and it's different again in the discussion. You think, how can it change 5 times through a paper? That worries me as an editor. It's either a lack of due diligence or there's something fishy going on with this data. Overemphasis or overinterpretation of data. Again, this hyperbola, this spin. Again, that's not a good thing. A lack of a pre-specified statistical plan or a lack of a pre-specified endpoint for your study. What are your objectives? If you specify you've got 3 objectives, report the results of the 3 objectives. Don't report just one. The over-reliance on ad hoc or exploratory analysis, again, that's a clue to us that perhaps the main study didn't work. And this author group have gone on a fishing expedition to find a positive result. The use of wrong statistical tests, the use of outmoded analytics, and the over-reliance on very rare and perhaps unvalidated analytical tests. As I say, I've been an editor at Lancet Oncology now 23, going on 24 years. I've seen tens of thousands, probably 100,000 papers in that time. I know most statistical tests, and when I see a really odd name for a statistical test, being the cynic that I am, I think obviously all the other ones didn't work then. And the authors have found a stats test that gives them the answer they want. And then sometimes when I get a paper, the data are just too good to be true. And that's a gut feeling, and it comes from reading a lot of papers. Quality of life and patient-reported outcomes increasingly important these days. Those days of the big blockbuster drugs changing the universe, they've really gone. It's about toxicity, it's about how patients manage on their treatment. But there are very specific instruments used for those, very specific instruments in terms of qualitative research, and even more specific instruments when you start talking about patient-reported outcomes and quality of life. So what I'm looking for when I see those papers come in, is it a valid endpoint in the study? Is it protocol defined? Is it using a validated instrument? So this is a questionnaire that's been, if it's been translated, it's been forward and backward translated, it's been tested in different cultural settings. I used to do a lot of work with the EORTC, who do a lot of these quality of life instruments. And there was an example that one of the researchers there gave me one time when they were translating a particular pain